Hi, everybody. Welcome to our final lecture on critical theory. So today we're covering Marxist criticism, which, as by the name, is based off the ideas and the publications of Karl Marx, which is also coupled with communist ideology. So today might be a bit of a longer video, and of course you in the future know exactly what this video is going to be lengthwise. I'm not entirely too sure. I'm aiming for about 20 minutes, but we'll see how we go. So to understand, I think, more fully how Marxist theory works, we need to really get into depth with the Communist Manifesto and the general guiding principles of communism according to Karl Marx, for which this theory is named. So key concepts. We'll get started here. This is, as I've said, it's rooted in Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto. So not to knock Friedrich Engels, who also co-wrote the Communist Manifesto with Marx. We just generally take this theory and connect it to Marx. However, he's not the only person who helped create this. This text is also emerging at the same time that the revolutions of 1848 are starting, and very generally, very surface, that historical era or time or event, if you would, is occurring because lower and middle class peoples, pardon me, seek to reform their societies. And this has got quite a bit to do with the system of monarchy and of absolute rule and the people's will to change that or to do away with that. You are free to research that on your own time, but this is no coincidence that these ideas are coming about at the same time. In a sentence or in a phrase or in a nutshell, the Communist Manifesto is a political document. It seeks to outline its beliefs and to explain itself, and also analyze historical and present class struggles. When I say present, that means 1848 class struggles at the time this is published. And it also seeks to explore the conflicts of a capitalist structure and the mode of production, right? How these are inherently problematic. And these are some weird words. We're going to get to them. So the mode of production is the systems of a society, how we organize the production of goods and services, how we distribute goods and services. So you can think of a free market of privately owned business and factories, for-profit businesses and factories, so on and so forth. I'm not claiming to be an expert on communism or capitalism. I try not to subscribe to anything obviously politically wise with this. I'm not saying I'm a communist and that you need to be a communist too. I'm just explaining the context, and which I think will help you understand the whole idea of this theory. Another idea of the modes of production is that the owning class, that elite group of people who maybe oppress that majority or everybody else, extract surplus value for the pursuit of profit. So think of the markups on product, right? So these private factory owners produce a good and will then sell it for a higher price. And then the people who purchase that product, like a retail store, will then sell it at a higher price themselves to pursue excess capital. And some more concepts. The manifesto argues that the powers that be, of course in the 1848, in that time frame, acknowledge communism is powerful and thus will seek to oppose it. The history of society in this manifesto is a history of class struggles. This is nothing new. This has been going on since societies have existed, that an oppressed majority, think our blue-collar workers, right, has always been under the yoke or under the control of an oppressive minority, an elite, small group of people who are maybe exceptionally wealthy. So the few control the many, for instance, in this case. In capitalism, the working class, the blue collar class, right? Us people who work for our living, retail, or maybe work in an industrial way, or babysit, anything like that, right? We're not property owners. We're not landlords. We don't own these businesses or these factories and rake in all this money. We are a working class. We're blue collar. Consistently, this group of people called the proletariat. So when I throw that word out later in this lecture, you're going to know what that means. It means the working class. You can think blue collar people. So certainly not your CEOs and stuff like that. The proletariat struggles against the owners of the means of production in a capitalist society. So the people who make and produce these goods are called the bourgeoisie. So again, when you know that word, you can think of this elite group of people who control the production and seek excess capital and excess profit. And in the communist pool of thought, this struggle between the working class and the owners of production will end in revolution. There is no other way but for the proletariat to become conscious of their potential, rise against the bourgeoisie, and overthrow them. And this process will restructure and reform society. So in this train of thought, there is no way for things to get better except through revolution. That's an important thing for later. And this is precisely what may make communism or communist ideology appear radical, because they strongly hold that things will never change, right? The elite will never give up their power, their money, so we have to overthrow them. We have to take it by force. That is the only way to make things better. And of course, another idea is that the bourgeoisie exploits the proletariat for their labor, creating profit and capital for themselves. The first that comes to mind when I think of this is like the phrase which you may know, that's kind of tongue-in-cheek, it's kind of cheeky, where people say the machine of capitalism is oiled by the blood of its workers. And of course, I think of perhaps even Amazon with the amount of, hours that their employees will work in relation to the low amount of wages that they receive and the low amount of breaks or labor rights that they also receive. So their work or their need for money, need for a way of life is being exploited to create even more capital for the bourgeoisie or the elite that control them or rely on them. And some more key concepts from the Communist Manifesto is the Communist Party will not oppose other working class parties. We're not here to compete with you. However, the Communist Party seeks to express the general will and desires of the world's proletariat, of the world's working class, and will defend the common interests of the world's proletariat. So while you may not subscribe to the ideology of the Communist Party, you may not be a communist yourself, the party seeks to protect the working class all over the world and represent your best interest. And their list of demands, since no political document is complete without some type of demand or recommendation or plan for things to get better. Now, keep in mind again, I've repeated this a few times, but this was published in 1848. The manifesto was published in 1848. However, I think you're going to see a lot of similarities in the demands here as compared to things that we in 2020 may also be seeking or demanding ourselves. Get ready. This is going to be amazing. So, a progressive income tax. Very generally speaking, of course, a progressive income tax. The whole idea is you're taxed in relation to how much you earn. So a millionaire will pay more in taxes than somebody, for instance, who makes $30,000 a year, right? So it's, say, a set percentage of somebody's income. So 20% of somebody who makes $30,000 a year is way different than somebody like Jeff Bezos, for instance, since I'm thinking of Amazon. A multi-billionaire, 20% of his income is going to be quite a bit different. But in this way, it's relatively equal. You may have also heard of some countries that do progressive fining, for instance. Like people who are millionaires who get a speeding ticket pay um, tens of thousands of dollars in a fine for that speeding ticket, as compared to somebody who might make $2,000 a month, would not be paying that amount, but would be paying an equal amount based on their income. So that is one demand of the manifesto. They also sought to abolish all inheritance and private property for the good of everybody else, essentially, that things should be publicly owned and distributed equally and shared with each other. Abolish child labor, free public education. Of course, for the time frame, I would interpret that to mean like a public education, perhaps to like a middle school level, or maybe even a high school level. I'm not 100%, but it certainly wouldn't be something really extensive. As far as I know, I could easily be wrong. But that could easily translate to what we ask for today, perhaps as a society, or what we're curious in. For instance, a free public college education might be something similar there. The Communist Manifesto also advocated for a nationalized transportation system and communication system. They also sought to seek, my English is working great, thanks for bearing with me, demanded a centralized credit or like a national bank so that everybody goes to the same institution for loans, credit, so on and so forth. And that way it's more equal, it's more checked, so that you're not going through maybe several institutions trying to find a good interest rate or trying to get the loan that you need, so on and so forth. Expand publicly owned land. A main trend in this school of thought is that things should be for the public. Things should be for everybody and not just for those who could afford it or who could own it privately. And all of these things together should, or hopefully will, lead to a stateless and a classless society. These are things that will equalize people and make things for the greater good and not for the good of just the wealthy elite. And you thought we were done? Not quite. Still have some more things to go. A big thing to consider here, especially in reference to the manifesto, is it also seeks to differentiate itself from socialism. So, communism isn't socialism. What the manifesto did at the time, it did a lot of things. This is just one thing it did. Is it tried to explain that all of these socialist doctrines of the time frame are good, they have good ideas, but they are not what we are doing here in this manifesto. We are not similar, or well, we are not identical, I should say. They have some similar ideology, but we are different in distinct ways, and this is why. Socialism primarily fails to understand the role of revolution, right? This Communist Manifesto strongly holds that revolution needs to occur. It will occur. It is a natural accompaniment that people will just get tired of it. They will realize their own worth and they will overthrow the bourgeoisie. Socialism is a little more democratic. It seeks to reform society through democratic means. And it might be a step in the right direction. However, the communist ideology upholds that the wealthy or the elite will not give up their power or their money democratically or willingly, right? That's not going to happen. So it needs to be done by force. We need to rise up against them. We need to break our chains and take back what is good for everybody and not just for the few. And of course, under socialism, people can own property, but they do share some very general ideas, which this isn't about socialism, this is about communism, so we won't go into that too deeply. Directly from Marx, this is another good way maybe to summarize his ideology and how it might also be similar to socialism, right? So from each person, according to his ability, right? Think of a progressive tax rate. We take from you according to what you bring in, right? You make $50,000 a year. We'll tax you based on that and not based off some huge bracket that people who make $50,000 to $100,000 a year will pay. So you're not going to pay the same amount as somebody who makes $90,000. You're going to pay based on your $50,000. And to each, we're going to give you what you need according to your needs and not based on what you can afford necessarily. I might relate that, of course, to like student loan forgiveness. So people who didn't go to college don't need that, so they won't get that money, but people who did would need that. So that's my interpretation of it. Feel free to interpret that how you wish, but we're going to take from you according to what you can provide, and we're going to give to you according to what you need, is coming from Marx here. And the key questions. So these are things that a Marxist critic might look at or ask when they are reading a text or analyzing a piece of literature. What is the social class of the author? You should definitely consider that in relation to Virginia Woolf, because she is certainly not poor or lower class or working class. She didn't go to college, but that's typical for the time period, as compared to her brothers who did, and that's more of a gender thing and not a financial thing. But she's also certainly not obscenely wealthy, right? There's a balance to things here. She's, of course, in the time frame, this is relatively appropriate, but she and her family and her sister are able to have servants in the home. Virginia and her husband Leonard also operate a printing press for a while as a hobby. So you can imagine maybe doing a startup like that in your own home. That certainly, I'm sure, is not cheap. But at the same time, their printing press wasn't raking in a huge profit. It was more for fun, and they published just whatever they felt like publishing and printing. It wasn't a huge recognized business. What class does the work seem to represent? What are the classes represented in the text? Looking at that, you'd be curious to maybe compare what socioeconomic status Clarissa might be as compared to Septimus, as compared to the servants at Clarissa's home, as compared to Doris, for instance, who's a teacher. Some things to consider. What values does the text reinforce? What values does it oppose, undermine, or overthrow? You can think of that, of course, politically, in reference to society or structure of society, or class. You might find that Woolf is a little critical, perhaps, of Clarissa's position socially and economically, that her activities might be a little trivial, right? She's throwing a party. I can't imagine that's cheap. And she has quite a few well-to-do people invited to that party. Think of maybe the idleness of her life, and is Woolf making a statement about that? What social classes do the characters represent, of course? How do characters from different classes interact or even conflict? You may want to consider, how do the doctors treat Septimus, for instance? I know one of them, I can't quite recall the name, is quite wealthy. You can assume that based on him having a car for the time period, and that he uses the car quite a bit to make home visits, so he can afford to maintain and upkeep that vehicle. And I can imagine that as well is also not cheap to have a doctor come to your home in this time period. So how does he treat Septimus and treat Rezia, maybe as person to person or as members of different classes, versus considering how he treats them as a patient? That's something you could consider. What conflict can be seen between the values that the work supports and those that it portrays? Is there some conflict in maybe the amassment of wealth, or is the novel kind of overthrowing the value of having more money or being wealthy? How is it portraying or attacking, or what's the tone regarding these values that it presents? What's the relationship between power and authority and money? Two people with quite a bit of authority or power in the text also seem to have quite a bit of money. How is that relating to each other? In what ways might the text act as propaganda and support status quo? In what ways might it undermine it? As I've hinted at, you might note that Woolf can be perhaps a little critical, or that she is being a little critical of the London society at the time, and you might find that she is not. That is up to you if you'd be interested in exploring that in your paper, if you are interested in Marxist theory. Who is the oppressed? Who is the oppressor? What does the work say about oppression? Are social conflicts ignored, or are we provided an excuse, or is something else blamed or to blame for the social conflicts rather than perhaps class or oppression? And of course, additional reading. I found this article through the databases, so you can access that too. It tackles quite a bit with Mrs. Dalloway, more than just Marxist criticism. It also does a little bit of feminist theory, a little bit of like cultural criticism, but it might be useful for you to peruse that. The language could be a little difficult in this article, so do go slow. Take notes, look up things if you don't know what they mean. Take your time with it if you want to read it. Of course, you may try to read a Communist Manifesto if you so choose. That could be a challenge for you, full disclosure. But I will not stop you if you are really interested. And of course, the link to the Purdue Owl has its own reading list you may consider for use in your own paper or for considering this school of thought further. So that concludes the lecture today on Marxist theory, and you'll hear me in the next one. I'll see you then.